Do. Ooh, it might be saying that. Fab. Cool. I would strongly encourage everyone to time themselves. However, I will also be timing because that is part of the job. I will do rough air clapping to not disrupt the neighbours at the relevant times to indicate the things that you will know what they mean. Otherwise, call upon the Prime Minister to begin the case for prop.
Hi, before I begin, a couple of things. First, to all those of you who are comfortable doing so, can you please turn your cameras on? I think it makes the debate a whole lot more lively. Two, I'll take POIs verbally, as I cannot see the chat, so please don't do anything in chat. I cannot see you. And third, just shout out to Franka for being an awesome partner for the in-rounds of this comp thus far. It's been a blast debating with her. I've learned so much. Beginning my speech momentarily. The first thing we will do in open government is explain what this debate is and what this debate is not about. And then we'll forward one broad claim, why we get more competition on our side of the house and why this is good, why we get more quality products and why the money goes to better areas. The first thing we want to do, though, is to do a very simple model. We are fine, happy banning, like we're happy to ban this in most or all cases when there is sufficient, when there is deemed to be sufficient market competition. Like intuitively, we think this looks like government regulators looking into whether or not there are alternatives. Obviously, we're not going to ban you from like for example, having Google Flights on top of Google Search if there is no fucking alternative to Google Flights. I think the framing then here is very simple. What does self-referencing look like? I think it looks like you being pushed to the top of the search engine or pushed to the top of the ads when you're on a platform that you have a financial connection to, i.e. Google Flights being pushed to the top of Google Search, i.e. Kindles being pushed to the top of the Amazon search engine, which is an aggregator of different goods and services, yet arbitrarily preferencing the Kindle as the most important thing because the Kindle is associated with Amazon, and Amazon has a profit incentive to want to increase the sales of the Kindle. Claim one, competition is good. On the comparative, you get bad products and bad services. We get far more niche and nuanced services that are often accomplishable at far lower levels of cost. Let's characterize this here. One, when you have different companies competing against one another, you create the space for new companies to thrive. You create market niches. The problem with their comparative is that when you have a degree of self-preferencing, the only thing that people end up seeing are platforms like Google Flights or platforms like the Amazon Kindle. Why is this true? One, because there's currently a monopolization on tech platforms. Google is the search engine that fucking everybody uses. I don't need to prove this, it's just fucking obviously true. Secondarily, Amazon has the largest network effect, so everyone uses Amazon to buy goods and services. These platforms have a monopoly on the existence of search engines and aggregators for providing goods and services. And thus, most consumers are going to use Google or use Amazon on both sides of the house because consumers do not want to spend hours scouring what the best headphones are to buy or what the best flight site is. Most people simply want to buy the product they're trying to buy, which is Op's best line in this debate. I'll say why this gets far better on our side of the house. One, when the way in which the consumers interact with Google or Amazon is often the path of least resistance. When you self-preference, your product is front and center. It's at the very top. So it's the idea that people engage with the most. But also, this often is done in a way that drowns out other more competitive products, i.e. Google will often deliberately rank Expedia in the Google search engine rankings to promote Google Flights if they know that Expedia is a good competitor to them. This is what we stand behind banning. The comparative is you simply have more exposure. And I want to be very nuanced here. How do these search algorithms work in absentia of search preferencing? What happens on the comparative is that you constantly push up the most popular things when you don't have self-preferencing, i.e. when Google Flights is most popular, other people see Google Flights as popular, but when Expedia is quite popular and Expedia is quite good, you'll see Expedia. No, the way in which this interacts depends a lot on the terms that you search up. For example, if on our comparative you search up cheap flights or you search up premium flights, you're likely going to get different results because different products and different companies appeal to that market niche. On their comparative, Google Flights will always appear first because Google will arbitrarily push it to the top. But third, note, you see multiple different apps on our comparative when there's a fair degree of competition. And what does this look like? It looks like there being a profit incentive for different businesses to differentiate, to conquer different market niches. Really good book by Peter Thiel named Zero to One on on this, by the way. What does this look like in practice? It looks like Trivago offering really good comprehensive sales packages of hotels and flights packaged together and dominating that space. It looks like Expedia having a really good degree of connection in terms of aggregating together different stops for different flights, which is why a lot of people flying to Glasgow this year will use Expedia to book their flights. What goes up is what the majority consumer prefers, i.e., if you care about cheap things, and a lot of consumers care about cheap things, when you search up flights, the general aggregate preference will rise to the top on our comparative. But secondarily, if you have a more niche and more nuanced preference, if you want a specific type of drawing app or whatever, you simply get that far more on our side of the house when you don't have this type of arbitrary preference. But fifth, people see these alternatives as legitimate options because note the way in which people psychologically interact with content online. When content arises to the top of a page, when content is front and center, you perceive that content, you perceive that app, you perceive that product to be better, even if it is not. The comparative is you simply get far more products rising to the front and rising to the top without this self-preferencing. Before I go on, this back half of the POI.
Yeah, clarification. Would you ban Windows from coming pre-installed on PCs?
This debate says online platforms like Google and Amazon. Microsoft is not a fucking online platform. But two, the reason why it's bad to do this on online platforms is because that's where sales happens. The reason why it's fine that Microsoft puts Windows on like Windows computers is because Microsoft is not using this to sell a particular different set of thousands or millions of products. The problem is companies like Amazon and Google often offer a lot of different products because they have a lot of investment capital and they're able to conquer a large sector of the market. What then is the impact of all this argumentation? One, consumers simply get way better quality and quantity of goods and services at cheaper prices because products compete against one another because they're constantly competing to rise to the top. And note here, if they say the comparative is ads, note that even if even if companies advertise on both sides of the house, what's important and nuanced here is that different companies will pay you to advertise their shit, and the ads will also work on a similar algorithm to this. The impacting then is that consumers simply have access or simply have knowledge and are simply willing and able to act on buying products and goods and services that far more fulfill their preferences. But two, we get far more market competition, which creates a race to the top in terms of quality, since you're always trying to one-up your competitor on a particular niche to dominate that search engine, to dominate that field, but also because you simply just get a way greater degree of exposure to different products, which is why there's a capacity to compete on our side of the house. But secondarily, the weighing here is very important. Smaller businesses and more businesses getting money circulates money throughout the economy faster and grows the economy faster because small businesses have to spend all their money to survive. Rich companies do not. That is why we grow the economy more. Happy to win, OG.
I thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for the op bench.
Can I confirm you can hear me? See me? Terrific. You guys in the chat, probably from back half. Don't unmute yourselves. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One simple extension that's just going to be intuitive, firstly, and secondly, it will just win. First of all, explaining how this is likely to look like and why oftentimes the amount that you have to scroll to find another competitor is a mere inches, and how oftentimes this whole thing on axis of what site you see is marginal. The differences in this debate is the quality of the sites that exist and compete with Google and the quality of Google flights itself. At the point where there's more quality in that and where consumers can easily, scroll down to a second option that is now better developed, that's when they have more choice because the service that comes at the second is better. The comparative is better. You have Google Flights at the top compared to having Expedia, or compared to the second comparative where instead of Google competing by putting this at the top, it simply doesn't sell cookies and advertising and algorithmic preferences to other people. A couple of points on framing. How is it likely that this Google things works? One, I think it is better aligned towards consumers because oftentimes what is advertised within an aggregate selling platform is based on the preferences. That is, my Google Flights is different from Jack's Google's Flights and different from my own partners because it's based on my own data. Oftentimes, the biggest platforms track the most data because people are most there and have the most amount of personal data. And oftentimes, because it's prestigious to work in these companies where they pay more, they oftentimes have the best engineers that have developed the best algorithms, which they've patented and are proprietary. So if you show me Google Flights at the top and use the full extent of all the algorithms that have Google, it is likely that if it aggregates the same flight as Expedia, it aggregates them better. But it can be, maybe Google wants to do price gouging and won't do like the best prices for me or like the best services for me, like Expedia. I think just this isn't true at the point where I've shown that they have capacity. But two, notice people care about Google a lot, and when Google promotes something at the top and it's a flop, it is huge because people expect quality from Google, and it is the most fun to make fun of the big dog when they fuck up. So probably you have an incentive to have the best amount of services. But two, how do people like actually search stuff? Oftentimes buying a flight or buying something is a financial investment and you don't want to get ripped off. People like look from multiple sites often for flights, or like even when you buy something simple, you look for the best deal if you have a coupon and stuff like that, especially when people are more cash constrained due to the cost of living. The end impact of this framing is one, probably there's pressures on Google's in order to be competitive, to get market size beyond the marketing advantage. Because notice, have you seen Google? Literally, the other sites are a couple of scrolls down. To get you to not scroll down and like make full advantage of self-preferencing, you often have incentive as Google to make this the best amount of the best type of service for consumers. So if Google is strictly better than Expedia because of all the reasons I gave, I don't care if instead of the algorithm preferencing Expedia, it shows me Google. It is a net better option. I'd rather have that. But I'd rather have something else. I'd rather have Expedia or the site below Expedia be better than in the comparative. Why is this true? Notice that Google, even though it puts its stuff at the top, has no incentive to be completely predatory with other sites. Oftentimes, it wants multiple revenue streams, and it knows it has the unique advantage of your user data. You make a lot of money from cookies, from selling that advertising to make it personalized from other companies because you're selling goods that are better if they're personalized. So oftentimes, even if Google is at the top, the other services still have some sort of good algorithmic preference towards you because Google has the incentive to sell them to create multiple revenue streams and capitalize on one of the key advantages it has. The implication of that is that also the other services become better because as I framed, people still have massive access to them and still have a preference to them. But there's also mechanisms out of Google becoming better that make the other services better. One, if you're competing with someone that has an advantage you can never circumvent, notice you can never circumvent this form of self-marketing, you're forced to look in the other parts of your product mix. Just make your search experience better. Have a deal with a certain hotel company that gives you better. It better directs the other companies to do better stuff. And the difference is, often with Expedia, you know that the product is undifferentiated as yours, insofar as they're not a tech giant with special advantages. But when Google has something special, you have more incentive to look at them. But two, just have you seen tech bros? They want to dethrone who's at the top. And sure, maybe you're top in the algorithms, but that's not seen as a permanence. When this self-marketing is, it's seen that Google has a permanent advantage and there's more prestige and effort put in research because of that. But three, just specifically on flipping niches. Notice that if a main aggregator site exists, oftentimes by nature of its algorithms being very preferential, it isn't very dedicated to niches, but people still have a preference to niches. Maybe I like a certain train company. Maybe I like X. So probably knowing that a lot of the market for like the general is taken by Google, companies are better directed towards niches. And also people know that because Google is at the top, they would prefer niches. And if they don't want to search Google, they search up, for example, discounted flights or something like that. And there's better foot traffic going towards those niche companies. People overall have better options. I'll take closing.
Look, say I buy your whole case. If Google is as good as you say, people are still going to use it. Why does it need to self-preference itself to the top of results?
I mean, because it does that, and I'll explain this I'll explain this a bit later. Why does Google have to do this? I think that if you ban and they can no longer do this, you just push them into worse types of behavior. Notice that oftentimes when Google creates this new service or Facebook creates it, it is nascent. It has just been developed. People don't know much about it. And it's uncertain if we'll get much users or if like the stakeholders will prefer it because in the short term, it's not profitable. But notice when you have this thing, when it's at the top, automatically more people will click in than on the comparative. That means that Google is more willing to research into those things because now it knows when it comes to market, it comes with a unique advantage. The difference is that now Google develops more platforms, so there's more competitions towards the existing companies and more innovation overall, which wouldn't happen if they wouldn't have the certainty that with this, they would gap the low sales initially when people don't know about the initial foot traffic. But two, at the point where you cannot like self-preference your own thing with others, you'll go with more backhand things. For example, not selling your cookies, which Google can better defend because it's their own private property. You can tamper with your algorithms insofar as they're black boxes and people don't know about them. You box out your competitions more when you don't know that you have an inherent advantage that you can use, and that overall, as I've explained, lets customers have some amount of choice. And insofar as it's easy to scroll down, the choice to not scroll down is a revealed preference towards it, and just people get better choice. For all these reasons,
I thank the Leader of Opposition for a fine speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for prop.
Thank you, Jack. 1 second. Let me get my phone. I'll have the same request as Arjun, which is that I get real anxiety from talking into the void. And this time I would actually like people to hear that question and turn on their cameras. Thanks, guys. That's really nice of you. Betrayal fallacy. Sorry. POI's in the chat, please. I can see the chat and I'm easily distracted. Can you hear me, Jack? Good. In 3, 2, 1. Panel, I know that it sounds like a very small impact if we say that you get a slightly better choice in which flight company you get to choose or which notebook you get to choose. But I think the impact here is twofold and quite likely. One, consumers just deserve the best products they can get and they deserve to have some influence over their preferences. But two, we also think that just like in a multipolar world, I think a multipolar market is probably better than a monopoly because small businesses often create more value towards the actual markets, because all their money is going back to labor costs and all their money is going back into improving products. And this is why I think that having a diversity of companies is better than one company using its own algorithm to push its own products and thereby creating a strong monopoly. But before I go on, let's do a couple points of rebuttal. First, very easy point of rebuttal. I think Chris's POI kind of killed Stefan's entire case by saying if everything there was already good, then people would use it anyway. So I'm really unsure why the massive power that Google has in manipulating its own algorithm needs to be used to also be pushing its own products. Let's say on the comparative, you might ask, but Franka, then why is the alternative so much more democratic or so much better? Well, because even if a lot of companies right now work indeed on algorithms and like advertising preferences, at least advertising between other companies is still competitive amongst each other. So the likelihood that you're going to click on other ones or that they're like you're gonna at least see 3 similar products except for the first one only is already going to make a more diverse market or more companies influential than the added extensional and completely overpowering part that Google has by simply just adding or adjusting the algorithm of what you can see, which is a less game part and just a manipulative part on them. But the second part here is that Stefan says, oh, but it's not really a bad thing because if you really wanted it, you can just scroll down and click on another one. There's 2 problems with this. One, again, it defeats his own analysis. But second of all, I think that Arjun explains to you already that you can't just scroll down because Google has an inherent incentive to not make its number too close to it because that defeats its own competition and control over the market. It would defeat its own profit purposes. So it's more likely in every time that I open Google that I see the first thing that I really want from Google because I'm used to it more. And then second, I see something I've never heard of in the first place because that is something Google wants to do. Cool. 2 points of rebuttal and integrated extension on our own thing then. One, why is it that O doesn't have a case in saying this makes it so much better? Stefan explains that these companies have so much more data and so much better engineers, and therefore it is good. Note, the only thing that they explained is that these companies are better at pushing your algorithm or gathering your data based on the preferences or based on the fact of the companies you clicked on before. What they do not have is data on whether you actually enjoyed that experience or whether you would have also enjoyed other experiences had you had the option to also go for them. And I think that is an important thing, because Google has a couple of incentives not to always care about the best experience, even if it's the best or even if it's the biggest. I think there's an inherent assumption in OO's case to say, oh, but if companies are really big, that means they have all the possibilities to also create a really good product, and therefore they magically also have the incentive to create a really good product. I think companies were different. I think Google doesn't have a really big incentive to constantly pour all its money into improving its product or caring more about the wages that it gives to the people that it works for them, or to caring more about its consumers. It has an incentive to stay on top of the market because it makes more money. That means a lot of the added money and a lot of the added power that it gets from going there is probably going back into manipulating that algorithm even further and to ensure their own monopoly further, to probably down the price or down the quality of their products, so they have to spend less money on it and they can make more profit on it and find ways and loopholes out of actually figuring out that their product is going down, or that the enjoyment of that product is going down, especially because they can't see any other alternatives. On the comparative, because this isn't happening and because all advertising will be competitive, that still means that sometimes, sure, people will develop preferences that they don't easily deviate from because people have are psychologically geared towards consistently choosing one. But it will be harder if you see something that is very comparable to it and you have a bad experiences to switch to the other app or switch to the other site or click on the other flight provider because you think that the last time you did it with this one, it was a really big headache. I had a bad experience with Momondo last time, so now I'm going to Skyscanner because that experience was bad and their advertisement is largely competitive and similar to each other, so I'm looking more towards the other one. But if it's a really niche and smaller one that I've never heard of and I have to compare that constantly with the basic service that I get from Google and I get that in my face all the time, then that is a choice I won't make as easily. The impact here seems small, but I think it is very important that people get to have some form of influence over valuing and actually differentiating between the products that they get to choose and get to have some form of influence over them other than companies continually regulating what you want and what you want to do. But I think there's a second impact here, and that is the extension towards Arjun's case that I think is even more important. The thing with companies is that smaller companies often add more market value than large companies do. That is to say, smaller companies don't have all the money to manipulate all the algorithms or to get all the advertisements on top or to buy off other things. That means that smaller companies often have to work by their product generally being good and being working, by their better products or their proof of concepts towards other companies or towards you not failing consistently, and by getting fair wages for their employers, because otherwise those people won't work consistently. I think that means money pours faster back into the market and money goes and it has more impact on the more vulnerable parts on where you actually want it to happen. I would like those companies to have a larger market share than Google continuously crowding them out. And that is what happened. That is what happens at the time right now. That doesn't mean that there won't be like some companies doing better or some companies getting slightly larger, but it does mean that the playing field is equal, or you don't really get the silver bullet out of saying you just get control of the entire algorithm of what people see in the first place and therefore continuously click on. Before I go on, closing, opening. There's no POIs. Fair enough. I offered. Look, in the end, I think that is twofold. On OO, I get that they say more power means more good. I think we gave extensive or more capacity to do good. I think we gave extensive analysis to tell you a lot of these companies don't want to do more good. And doing more good would actually be stupid for them because it meant that they would lose power over their own monopoly and they have a very easy access towards doing something that crowds out other companies. On our side, we take out the silver bullet for these companies to continuously stay on top and create more competition for other companies. Even in the case where that competition isn't large, it at least means marginally more power towards consumers to choose the products that they really want and continuously evaluate it. Even if consumers have continuous psychological gearing towards the things that they really like, I think at least the added influence here, or the slight added influence on at least integrating whether you like the product, is already something that does better for the consumers. And I think that is something that's important in this debate. The second part is that even slightly differentiating between different companies means that the market gets more money towards the places where it's most vulnerable, where the places where people need it the most. I think those are important things you have to care about this in debate. I'm very proud to stand for OG.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a fine speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the top half.
Am I audible? Great, okay. POIs in the chat, please. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two parts in this speech. Firstly, I'll defend the material that Stefan brought to you and explain why it beats and wins the opening half. Then I'll do further extraneous response towards opening government to take them out of the debate. At the top of the speech, I just want to frame really quickly that I think a large part about opening government's case rests on demonizing these major platforms who provide, I would say, pretty good services to consumers. For the simple reason that Stefan told you, if these services that are being self-preferenced are just absolutely terrible, consumers would have already likely taken it upon themselves to pivot towards other services. Because realistically, what is the level of inconvenience that a consumer takes upon themselves when they choose to click a few additional pages? I think opening government's case to a very large extent hyperbolizes and exaggerates the level of inconvenience. And insofar as it can prove why consumers have a vested incentive to search for the best deal out there, I think opening government's harm in the debate is largely minimal and you should just throw them out. The first thing I want to explain is just why self-preferencing is going to be done well. And insofar as I think O is able to prove this, opening government has little to say as to why Google then is going to be quite malevolent, for example, when it engages in self-preferencing. We outline two main reasons. One, if you're the dominant provider of a service, it also means you're subject to the highest level of consumer scrutiny. So we live in an era of the post-Cambridge Analytica scandal. I think there's huge levels of consumer scrutiny, especially because there's a tendency to be suspicious of big data companies, for example, because they just don't want to get manipulated when their money is on the line. But the second and more compelling reason is that lower down firms also want to topple the more established one. And if we use opening government's analysis here, that it's relatively easy for you to tap into a new niche, I think that is precisely the reason why you can still be the largest provider of a service, but your position can be vulnerable at any point of time insofar as a newcomer enters the market, offers a more competitive service, and consumers just pivot towards it. On the wing, one, I think our framing explains that the behavior of mainstream platforms is likely going to trend positive as opposed to the very exploitative kinds of behavior that opening government wanted to push to. And opening government just lies here when they say that the services that Google Flights provide are just incredibly bad. No, I don't think that is the case. There's a reason as to why, to a certain extent, these services are likely going to be reflective of the consumer preferences because it's an aggregation of the data of when you consent to cookies on a page that tracks what you like and what you don't like. So you're not just recommending things that are absolutely divorced from the preferences of consumers. I would suggest it's the opposite. But the second thing I want to explain here, which I think Stefan already did a great job at, is just explaining why the comparative is going to be far worse on their side. Because if opening government is true to characterize that these search platforms are actually pretty malevolent and are profit hungry to the point where they just fuck over consumers, these are the very same actors who also exist on their side. And no, there's a spectrum of behavior that they can engage in now when you do things like ban self-preferencing on their side. One, if it is true that the majority of data are held by these huge platforms like Amazon or Google, who are massive search engines, then it's also very easy for you to gatekeep this information. Because no, the way services like Skyscanner or Expedia rely on consuming, on attracting consumers, is they obviously have to buy the data from somewhere. If Google is going to refuse to sell this data to them, these services are going to remain terrible on their side because obviously you can't reflect the preferences of consumers who you want to appeal to. Secondly, or if Google does choose, for example, sell their data, it's towards the highest bidder. And the problem with this then is that the already established companies are the ones who have the most capital to afford even buying such data to begin with. So you don't get the vague OG benefit of more companies entering into the industry the moment you ban Google, because guess what? They can't even afford to buy the data in order to create the best services. Thirdly, and I think this is the worst case which opening government never deals with, they can just straight up abuse their power to buy out advertising space that drowns out other companies on their side. Opening government never explains why, if it is true that these companies behave so badly in the status quo, why the corporate behavior is likely going to improve on their side the moment you slap a ban onto them. Thirdly then, unlike smaller companies increasing the market value of like of the market on their side, I think this is largely going to be symmetric because I'm unclear as to what is the level of change you get on the opening government case. I will posit there are multiplicity of other barriers that even limit companies from entering into these industries to begin with. One, the fact that this established brand image. Two, the fact that you're small, so it's unlikely you can compete with other massive service providers. Insofar as OG never illustrates what is the level of change, I'm unclear as to what benefit they're hinting at. But two, literally no one is stopping these smaller companies from coming into existence. What happens on our side is that you have a startup who comes up with a new way to, for example, like list sites that is actually quite good for consumers, and Google merely purchases that service off of them. I think these companies still exist on our side. The way in which you buy and sell things is just different. But into more extraneous response with the opening government case, the first thing I want to deal with is just this massive idea of competition. This is the greatest push from them. Two issues here. One, this analysis is just extremely generic to just like the regular way we buy and sell goods. If you kick out the big guy, more smaller ones can come in. But the nuance they miss out is that data collection is what determines whether or not the products you have on like the sites are compatible with the preferences of consumers. Whenever people are going to search things, they use the mainstream engines. And as I hinted at earlier, they hold all the data. It's unclear as to how these smaller ones are going to get it on their side. But why is it comparative dysfunctional? Look, all their examples are that of the status quo. The reason as to why Trivago does things like package things together is because self-preferencing happens and the third-party providers need to outdo themselves to capture the market audience. These are benefits that we exclusively claim on our side. Before we move on, is there a PY from closing?
Yeah, Stefan says that in the absence of self-preferencing, you don't allow competitors anymore. Do you want to expand on this a bit more because it kills OG?
Yeah, so the reason as to why I think you're unlikely willing to let competitors onto your site is because they're obviously going to be taking money away from you. I don't think I need to explain it any further. But why is it comparative dysfunctional? The biggest travel companies like Trivago and Expedia are still going to be the dominant players in the market on their side of the house because they have established brand image. They aren't maximizing choice here because you're not allowing new companies to enter. You're just going to let the big ones continue to exist. But the second and more important thing I want to do here is just question the scope of harm of opening government's case. Because note, the burden in a ban debate, and I'm sorry I have to say this, is that it needs to be a significant level of harm for you to warrant a ban. There's a problem-solution mismatch with the opening government case, insofar as I'm able to prove that this harm is relatively minimal. Why is this the case? One, I think opening government hyperbolizes the scale of inconvenience because they make it seem as if self-preferencing drowns out all the other services. No, it's just a few additional clicks. But even if a consumer just chooses to buy the service at the top of the page, clearly this is an express preference for convenience. I'm unsure as to why OG should dictate what a consumer, like what is a good consumer choice. But secondly, is this consumer manipulation? I would suggest that this is not the case, especially if there's huge amounts of money on the line. Consumers have an incentive to go and do things like research for all those reasons. But
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for a fine speech and call upon the Member of Government to extend the case for the prop.
Alrighty, can you hear me? Great. So in a motion about competition, opening government realizes that they should run a case about competition. Fair enough. However, their case is essentially there are a number of options that exist on these platforms. Now, when you get rid of self-preferencing, consumers are better able to like rationally choose between these options, and that is good. There are three key prerequisites to competition that they do not miss. These are each of these, by the way, are gaping holes in open government, any of which, if you think still stand at the end of the debate, you cannot give it to them. By filling these gaps, we will take it over them and win the debate. Number one, I just want to quickly point out that opening government is reliant on consumers actually having access to these alternatives in a meaningful way. And as opening opposition point out in both LO and DLO, oftentimes these companies that have lots of power, that have lots of sway in the market, will probably just act predatory in other ways and act to stifle competition by doing a series of various things. So a couple of things that we need to prove. Number one, that in the comparative, the algorithm is actually going to be good and is actually going to, like, they're not, like, the companies are not going to tamper with it in other ways, like Stefan says, in order to try and disprivilege their competitors in secret ways. The key mechanism here is that it's basically impossible to do this for two reasons. Number one, oftentimes these algorithms are just done by machine learning and they are relatively automatic. It is incredibly difficult to actually go in and directly tamper with them, especially in specific types of product, like vis-a-vis certain types of products. But secondly, because these algorithms are developed to be general purpose. That is to say, you want your sorting algorithm to work for every type of item. You want it to work well on your platform generally, right? Not just in terms of your flights, but in terms of everything that Google does or everything that Amazon sells. And so you want to make sure in general that it is accurate as possible, right? And so because these algorithms are basically one size fits all, and so you want it to be as good as possible, and you can't really change that for specific industries, specific products. Okay. Second key gap that opening government does not fill is that they're still going to allow competitors to operate on their platforms in the first place. Because as we POI DLO and DLO says, well, plausibly they're just going to be less willing, right, on the comparative to even let competitors operate on their platforms in the first place. Because like Amazon, Google, the App Store, all have to authorize competitors to go on their platforms to begin with, right? That is the prerequisite for any competition. Why will they still allow competitors? Three reasons. Number one, on a perception level, they still want to be seen as the marketplace. They want to be seen as the one-stop shop where everyone goes to for everything they could possibly need. And this damages their reputation. If all of their competitors, if all of the things that people actually like, if these that have the sizable consumer bases just disappear from these platforms overnight. But secondly, this makes them appear better to regulators in the long term. If they can go to these regulators and say, hey, we are actually acting in good faith. Don't open another antitrust suit against us, right? They appear far, far better to the government and and they can ward off potentially damaging regulation in the future to the extent they comply with this in good faith. But thirdly, because they just get personal benefits from having alternatives still sell on their platforms. It means they can still get cookies when consumers buy flights using Trivago, but off of their platform. They still get money off of the top when they have successful competitors selling products on their platform because they skim stuff off of the top and they want to keep them on those marketplaces rather than going somewhere else and selling it independently or selling on an alternative marketplace where they do not have access to that stuff off the top. So that's why the alternative is actually good, why competitors are still on these marketplaces, and why the sorting algorithm works well. Final key premise, and this is really important, that you actually have competition on, you actually have companies that will come up and act as competitors, right? So basically, opening government says now consumers can make more rational choices between the options that exist, but you need to have a meaningful amount of options that exist to begin with. Why is there more of that comparatively on the outside? One, alternatives are better able to get investment to get off of the ground in the first place, because if it is the case that you are if Stefan is right, these are relatively nascent industries, right? Things about information and stuff like that, and different marketplaces for flights and stuff like that. Then there's a bunch of companies that are going to try and go into this marketplace. At the point at which you as a startup company know that you are automatically going to be outcompeted by Google or you're automatically going to be outcompeted by Amazon, it is incredibly difficult to convince anyone to get that project off of the ground in the first place. It is very difficult to get investment at the point at which private investors think it is incredibly risky. Opening opposition says, in criticizing opening government, it's unclear what the level of change is, but obviously the level of change, especially in these nascent industries, is extraordinarily important. If you don't have any faith that the product is even going to reach consumers to the degree that you think you should, or to the degree that you need it to in order to actually turn a profit, obviously private investors are going to get spooked, not even able to get that project off of the ground to begin with. Secondly, because it means that competitors that already exist are more likely to actually choose to operate on these platforms to begin with, right? They're actually actually want to sell their products on Amazon or on the App Store because in the status quo, if they know they're automatically going to get outcompeted, they're just not going to do that. They're just not going to actually put their stuff on these platforms. And anyway, actually, before I go on, I'll quickly take opening opposition.
Yeah, so if all these companies have the incentive to seem favorable to regulators and have a wide mix of products, even if you do self-preferencing, you have stuff like an ad for another service, or sometimes you put other things at the top. Like self-preferencing is not that bad and your benefit is not that unique.
Mitigates everyone, brother. Like, I don't know. Like, if you want the debate to be incredibly marginal, it's bad for both of us. I think it's symmetric. Anyway, basically, these competitors opt into operating on these platforms to begin with because they actually have faith that they're going to be competitive, that they're not going to be screwed over by Amazon or Google, that these platforms just aren't out to get them and steal all of their money. They are more likely to do that in the first place. But thirdly, because now these competitors can actually think in the long term. The problem is that if you're going to be outcompeted and your capital is being squeezed from you in the short term, you are unable to do things like divert money into doing long-term development, long-term R&D and research to actually make your product better, because you need to constantly keep diverting money into the short term to make sure you don't just like disappear from the market and get absolutely crushed, right? That's exactly what Stefan says, which is that Stefan's argument is that this allows Google to like enter the market. But obviously the question has to be, where is there more benefit when you allow everyone else to also enter into the market? Because big companies are able to cross-subsidize. They're probably going to be able to take these risks anyway. You can't take these risks if you are a startup in a nascent industry. For all those reasons, we get around the comparative problem in top half and actually make sure that there is meaningful competition.
I thank the Member of Government for a fine speech and call upon the Member of Opposition to extend the case for the op bench.
All right. I might try stabbing and see if it works. Okay. POIs exclusively in the chat. Our case is going to be that these products, like Google Flights, like other things that are created by big tech, are largely good, that the consumers are pretty bad at making decisions about what is good, that if we put it as the first option for the most naive consumers who will do the least searching, this is broadly better than the counterfactual in which you get worse products and like more scams being used instead. What opening government is right about is switching costs. If you think about booking a flight through Google Flights, it involves 10 plus clicks where you have to do all of these searches and then get to the actual airline webpage, and then there's some hidden fees attached, and then you see the price, at which point it is far too late for most people to switch to a different place. Or if you look at like software as a service product, so like any kinds of software, like even like Google Docs and so on, in many instances, if it's not by a big tech company, you have to pay before you use it, and consequently, you don't know how good the quality is until you've already made that purchase. Even something like ebooks, you might buy an ebook on one platform or another platform, but you don't know about the quality of each platform or the reliability of the platform or how long you will be able to access those ebooks before like the startup company that built them shut down. So consumers are actually pretty bad at making these choices. And that's a crucial premise in opening government, because the opening government competition act relies on consumers making good choices by having lots of options. The problem, of course, is that the only thing that they end up proving is that there's a larger number of options, but not that the options are actually selected in a good way. What they say is that you choose the first option that comes to mind because it's the first thing up there and then no one else can compete. But this is something that CG then repeats. But this seems somewhat unrealistic. It seems pretty unrealistic to say that most people are choosing the first thing. I think what it actually looks like is you look at the first page of Google, you see a bunch of website names like Trivago and a bunch of other things that are not words in the English language. You see some like very like uninformative blurbs about how we're the #1 travel site. And then you click on one of them. Not necessarily the first one, just one of them. And I think the really big problem, however, even if you think that the consumers will only click on the #1 option, is that they run ads centered, right? Like the idea that as an individual, like if you choose the first option, you would choose the one that is just like an ad enabled site. So Expedia can advertise on Google under either side of the house and just like, and so it is equally arbitrary. It's not like you're choosing the one that the best algorithm that you can't tamper with because it's so complicated, as CG says, is the one that actually clicked, but rather it's just whichever advertised first. works, which is pretty arbitrary. So what we're going to argue is that the average quality of the services offered by big tech companies like Google is a lot higher, and that it is good if they are the first option, because the people who do click the first option click them instead of clicking the advertised product or something else. In other words, the fact that they're on the first page, the fact that they're up there and prominent is good, because naive consumers buy from big tech. Maybe it's not like the best product out there, but it is way, way better than the average product in that market for 4 structural reasons. The first reason is because of reputational concerns. Google has a huge reputational concern when it comes to the product it puts out, because it doesn't want to put the massive market of billions of users at risk. So it doesn't want to scam its consumers or extract as much profit as it can up front, because it knows that it will lose customers in the long run and that it will attract regulatory scrutiny. I think this means, for instance, that the sites that Google runs are likely to be incredibly reliable. You're unlikely to get crashes and so on to the same extent that you get in smaller companies that have more short-term incentives to raise cash. And this is the premise that closing government agrees with as well, when they say that these companies are unlikely to get investors unless they can prove that they get lots of revenue up front. Google doesn't have that same effect. That's why they can offer us Google Drive for free, for example, without really charging us very much money, because the revenue up front is not the major thing that influences them, but rather it's long-term reputation that they want to promote. The second reason why things that are created by Google are generally pretty good compared to their counterfactuals is because they have deep access to a deep pool of specialized talent. So you have specialized front-end engineers, specialized back-end engineers. You have people who have experience shipping products, not just like to a couple of their friends and their college roommates, but to like billions of users repeatedly, day in and day out for a lot, like the last 20 years of their career. Consequently, you get products that are much more reliable, but also products that the average consumer probably benefits from more, products that are easier to use, products that are less scammy. The third thing is that the profit structure and incentive structure of Google is very different designing something like Google Flights as compared to Expedia, which is to say that the way that they make money is not by like taking cash payments and charging people for the service, or by like increasing the markups on the flights, right? The way that they're making the money is by getting lots of people on their platform and thereby accessing a lot of their person's data and then advertising more, right? That's really good, because it means that you get a lot more free products on our side of the house, but also that I think ads are a much more progressive form of payment than something regressive like adding markups to flights or charging for a use of service. And that's for the simple reason that if I'm a rich consumer, I tend to like buy more stuff, and so the ads like impact me more, but like Google can still operate in the developing world on those same premises, versus like if you have a fixed cost where you charge everyone the same markup, that is an incredibly regressive form of expenditure and something that hurts the global poor. The fourth thing is data. Opening opposition, I think, to their credit, points this out, but they don't explain like the rest of it, of like why you actually need the privileging in order to happen. And the key premise, of course, is simply that consumer search is pretty weak. That's the key premise that lets us beat both top half teams. I think the fact that you have access to lots of data means personalization and so on. So the group of the first choice of consumers, the people who click on the ad under the government side, will now click on the Google ad on our side. And that is particularly good because they were probably pretty naive before, and we're able to protect them from scams, we're able to protect them from startups that are just generally suboptimal, that are unreliable, that won't give them what they want. We think Google is a lot better at that. I'll take opening.
Just because short diagonal cannot crack the psychological mechanisms why people seek out niches and why these rise to the top do not mean that they do not exist. You need to engage with our analysis as to why consumers seek out and make good decisions.
Yeah, but your analysis is just like consumers look at a bunch of different products and then make a decision. The problem, of course, is firstly, it is contradiction with the rest of your case, in which you say that consumers will look at the first option and this will create market dominance for Google. That's the first problem. The second problem is that insofar as that consumers can try and search, what is less clear is whether they'll be good at searching. And I think I give a reasonable illustration of the problems that exist with searching for different sorts of alternatives that makes it very difficult for consumers to do well. Finally, let's just deal with, I think, the one relevant thing from closing government, which is the level of competition that you end up getting. They say that competitors will like not be able to enter because they will not be able to compete against Google and so on, repeating the lie that opening government tells you, which is that everyone chooses the first option. But even if only like 60% of people choose the first option and the other 40% don't, that's still a pretty sizable number of people in the world who can create markets for startups. And crucially, the people who are likely to be able to enter startups aren't looking to capture 100% of the market. Even if they only capture 5%, that's still a significant amount of money. And that is why startups are likely to continue to enter on either side.
I thank the member of opposition for a fine speech and call upon the government whip. to conclude prop bench.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Brilliant. Okay, I'll take opening, so please put it in the chat. I would love to hear from you guys. Give me like literally 45 seconds per my rules-based allowance of time before I begin my speech, and I'll get going. Okay, can I? I'll use my phone. All right. The case you get from Aidan is rather simple. We prove to you why competition is possible and why it is that other actors will exist that enable this competition to happen. Crucially, the rest of this debate falls apart if the other teams cannot show to you why it is that you have the choices to be able to choose between. This is a crucial premise for the case to connect in the first place. In this speech, I first want to deal with what closing opposition give you, then I want to deal with opening government, and finally with opening opposition. Firstly, on CO. Look, the only response they have for us is just being mean to what you hear from Aidan. That is, I don't think they substantively engage with the case we give you about why it is that you have positive incentives to allow new companies and new actors on your platform in the first place. I want to briefly deal with the few positive contributions we do get from them, though, in their case. The first thing they say is, consumers are unable to actually check alternatives or actually properly value check the products they give. Firstly, this presumably already damages your own case. That is, if consumers don't evaluate products well, it's not clear why Google does have the pressures and incentives to make good products in the first place. However, I would posit that this straight up is in tension with what you hear from Stefan. As in, Stefan tells you that on the platform you are on, you're still very likely to scroll through and look at other options. Therefore, given that most of these are reasonably convenient, I don't think that the CO analysis actually sticks, given that you are on the fucking internet. You can presumably see the products you're accessing. I don't think that it's true that you don't alter the alternatives. Secondly, though, I just don't think this affects our case. Our case is that there is nothing else to look at in the first place. If they don't convince you why it is that these competitive pressures do exist, their case doesn't connect to there being competitive pressures on Google to maintain their reputation. Next up, then, I want to deal with this idea about Google being like a good actor and having an incentive to like provide good products to people. I want to immediately note that unlike what is falsely claimed about Aidan's case, this is actually derivative of opening opposition. Now, they already do this analysis. Now then, I want to respond to both CO and OO in these claims. The important framing here is that as far as things go empirically, these big things aren't good services. Platforms like Zoom, like Facebook, like Google cookies, like all of these things tend to be very outdated and very bad for the consumer. There are three structural responses for why this is true and why you don't get this pressure to make them better. One, you just don't worry about competitors because you have the capital reserves that allow you to basically cross-subsidize and take them out of the market when they do try to compete with you. Therefore, I think that this means that you don't have to worry about the new product being better than you because you know it won't be able to make more profits. You know you're still going to be attracting investment over it. Secondly, individuals have a huge anchoring bias to your service. This means that you don't worry about, I don't know, fucking Telegram or whatever taking over the place of like Messenger. You still know you're going to be one of the prime things people use, and worst case, you can just acquire them. You can just buy them out and shelf them. The third response, however, is that many of these online services are based on very shitty legacy code. Facebook was written in 2004. You're constantly operating the same service on antiquated code, and it's very difficult to do a rewrite. You just aren't able to access the new quality and the new services. I would posit that I have now proven to you, therefore, that most of these products are just going to be horrible. I don't think it's true for a position to say that these are somehow going to be good. Having established that, then, I want to then establish why our case and our analysis is crucial for resolving the clash on top half, i.e., on why it is that competition does happen. And I have convinced you that competition is crucial insofar as the product you have isn't adequate, is going to be overpriced, and not good for what consumers actually want. Therefore, what does Aidan give you an extension that wins the debate? A, we prove to you why micro-tampering isn't a possibility. It's never about meddling with the algorithm at the point of sale, but rather it's about the authorization of who is able to access the sales platform in the first place, i.e., who gets a market stall from which they can peddle their products on Google or on Amazon. So what is it that we give you then that contributes and wins on this clash? Firstly, Aidan explains to you why cookies are still massively beneficial. That is, even if you're buying from Expedia, the way cookies work is that they track you across the different pages you access. Therefore, the fact that you went on Expedia from Google is enough for them to be able to make profits in the first place. Therefore, opposition is wrong to claim that this means you have an incentive to stifle them out, per what OO says. Secondly, it's about the appearances you give to regulators. This is important because you want to show there's a plurality of products on your platform. Here, crucially, I want to deal with the POI we get from Stefan, because Stefan says, you want to look good to regulators anyway, so how is this my comparative? And this is where the crux of our case comes. That is, Aidan explains to you why it is that this is not going to be about Google not allowing people on side opposition, but rather why other companies are not going to want to be listed on websites like Amazon on side opposition in the first place. This is crucial for the regulator mech because it demonstrates why you're able to basically avoid the blame on side opposition. That is, when the regulators come to you and they say, why aren't you platforming other people? You're going to say, look, they just aren't applying to us in the first place. They don't want to market on our service. On our side, when competition is equal, alternatives will exist and they will apply to be selling on Amazon. That is when crackdown can actually happen. This is the most important mech insofar regulation has the biggest ability to curb the excessive power of these companies. The two mechs Aidan crucially gives you that prove then why it is that more companies do apply to market on websites like Amazon is that one, you get more investment insofar investors aren't spooked by the risk of not being able to get off the ground because of the monopoly of these big companies. But secondly, we explain to you why it is that you no longer lose out on the relevant profits, which I'm going to explain more on after I take a POI from Stefan.
Yeah, so everyone and their mother sells on Amazon. It's just untrue that third parties don't apply. But if big companies already have big capital reserve, it's unclear why investors have an added incentive to invest.
So unfortunately, Stefan, when I POI you to ask what happens with the alternative, you explicitly tell me that Google now becomes a worse actor, that they A, no longer sell their cookies, that they B, tamper with the algorithm, and that they C, they no longer go into new areas or they push people out per you and your deputy. OO already says these things. Therefore, our analysis is highly instrumental for explaining why you no longer go on there. And to reiterate then, the second mechanism is that the other companies like Expedia don't have a reason to want to be listed on Google Flights or to sell their products on Amazon. This is true for two sub-reasons. The first one is that it's not worth the cost for you to be on there. This is often going to take the form of a fee. It's going to take the form of losing out on website traffic. When you know you're being outcompeted by Amazon and Amazon-sponsored and cross-subsidized products that are more expensive and worse than yours, you don't want to put yourself on those platforms in the first place. Secondly, though, it's just harder to justify when you could be building up your own business instead. It is only when you have fair competition that these other companies are going to want to compete on these platforms. Therefore, we have A, demonstrated to you why these products are bad, and B, uniquely shown you why you get good market competition. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank the Government Whip for a fine speech and call upon the Opposition Whip to conclude round 5.
All right, cool. POI's in the chat. All right. Wait, starting my speech momentarily. So lots of different people use Google, naive people and smarter people, as Tanae points out. There are people who will only click the first option. There are people who click the first option and the second option, possibly even the third option. What CG tries to do is marginalize us by pretending that only the second group of people exists. But obviously, these groups of people exist on a spectrum. Some people don't have the time or the energy to research and look through competitors. So CO beats OO because we actually bother to think about who clicks only the first option. And let's be clear what the first option is. It's probably not a very good website because all other teams in this debate assume that the best website or the best service rises to the top. No, the first mover rises to the top because of the fact that a sizable number of people only click the first option. This is a positive reinforcing cycle that means that always this website becomes the dominant website, even if it's not necessarily the best website. So think, for instance, of Wikipedia. Often it is incredibly unreliable because a fuck ton of people click on Wikipedia. It means that it is always at the top, nonetheless, when it comes to looking, for instance, for research for any one individual. How did these people get to the top and stay at the top? Often, these smaller, services could engage in anti-competitive behaviors themselves. They could gatekeep data because they are smaller. They could buy over other companies. They could engage in predatory pricing. They themselves can also advertise on the platform. So, for instance, on Amazon, ads and sponsored ads aren't disclosed, so you wouldn't even know that the first option on your platform is even an ad. In fact, this system probably creates a perverse incentive for Google to no longer have these sponsored indication of sponsored ads on their platform, because now they need to make more money from ads, which means that you end up needing to ensure that these ads are profitable. So all of this necessarily means that it is very unclear to me that in the counterfactual, the best option rises to the top, which means that lots of people are not getting the best bang for their buck insofar as they're only clicking the first option. CG's response is very lame. They say Google doesn't want to provide the best products, but there are a number of very good reasons why Google does want to provide the best product. First, as they correctly point out, big tech comes under massive scrutiny compared to these smaller services. If you're a massive platform, even a small blip on any kind of a part of your platform creates huge reputational damage. So, for instance, the fact that Google is tied to their AI and the AI did some racist shit, suddenly there's massive news when it comes to the international community and everyone's reporting on it, because Google is so big, because it is a big tech firm where any one failure cascades to all the other services and all the other things that Google does on their platform. So they obviously have a reputational incentive to maintain a good platform in the first place. But also, as CG correctly points out, a crackdown can actually happen because these platforms are under heavy scrutiny. This creates incentives for you to do a good job insofar as you are constantly under pressure from regulators, from the politicians that exist on their side of the house anyway. Compare that to a smaller company that is a niche in a market that only some people care about. Not everyone gives a fuck about airplane prices, which means that you're not going to get as much scrutiny if your only niche is that you're a airplane price fare fucking service, which means that you get much less scrutiny, which means you're engaged in a sort of predatory behavior that keeps other competitors out of being the number one on your search engine, which means that you provide a worse product for consumers to begin with. The implication here is very simple. Google is always going to inherently be a better product, but under their model, it will never be at the top because of the positive reinforcement cycle that I talked about. All this means that people suffer as a result, and insofar as Tanae correctly points out a bunch of reasons why is it that Google is a better product, because of their profit structure, their reputation, so on and so forth, we ensure that the naive consumers get a product they can actually use, that they don't get scammed when they use in the first place. So that already deals with their both OG and CG. But CG has an additional claim: competitors won't want to get better. But I think that the counterfactual is worse on their side, because insofar as, if you think about it, if, for instance, Skyscanner and Expedia are necessarily number one on their platform, it's very unclear to me that just because you are number two instead of number one, your venture capitalists will not want to invest in you anymore, because there is another group of consumers that will look at number two, number three, and number four. Presumably, these companies already exist in the status quo. They already got funding in the status quo, even though Google is at the number one entry, because there's still a lucrative market out there of people who demand these products, who demand competition, because multiple groups of users exist. And that brings me to the second group of users, i.e. people who will actually look at competition. Before I dismantle OG on this, sure, OG.
If Google self-references and Google is always at the top, why the fuck do you not engage with Google Flights? Your framing disproves your own claim.
Why do I not engage in Google? What the fuck does that mean? Google Flights will not be at the top insofar as Skyscanner does all this predatory shit, which means that if you are number one, i.e. you're not, like, you don't self-reference, like, that's where you're, whatever. So let's talk about the other side then, like people who actually look at multiple options, right? And here, notice that this is the way that OG tries to win. OG basically tries to say, lots of people only look at the first option. We show that the first option is now a good option as opposed to a bad option. But there are also like other people who will look at other options as well, right? So there are a secondary group of users that will look at different options to begin with. In that particular scenario, what OO says is, since you only need to screw a few inches, it's very unclear to me why they won't in the first place. I think there is a better analysis here. The better analysis is, often when you are Skyscanner or you are Expedia, the reason why you want to be number 2 or number 3 is to attract those particular users who want alternatives, who want competition alternatives to Google. Usually, you've already incentive to be the better platform to begin with against Google. So, compared to Skyscanner having no other competition, because they are able to because they cannot fight against, because they can fight against other platforms that are similar but cannot fight against Google. Now you are having a situation where you all want to be number 2, and because you all want to be number 2, you're likely to position yourself against Google. Usually, you're going to try to provide a better product than Google to begin with. This pushes the industry forward as a whole. So, what does all of this mean? This means that for the vast majority of users, provide a good product for them. The alternative counterfactual that Tanae shows you that no other team engages with is that a bad product is going to be at the top of your screens. And when a bad product is at the top of your screens, maybe people who search for multiple different competitors will not lose out, but people who only search for the first option will lose out. And that is where we think the greatest impact is, because lots of people don't have the time to search for all of these different alternatives. For those reasons, CEO.
I thank the opposition whip for a fine speech. Whilst this is a closed round, you will know how closed rounds work. Lucy, however, wants me to record an OA. So before you hassle me later for feedback, I'm away this afternoon. Feel free to watch that OA first and then do the stuff. This is the weirdest OA ever. There's no teams. Cool. Thanks everybody. I don't know who I'm thanking. Let's just normally say that. That was a good debate. We came to some unanimous parts to the call and many not unanimous parts to the call. We ended up giving the first to the team in closing gov, the second to the team in closing opposition. This was on a 2-1 split with the chair in the minority. We gave the third to opening op and the fourth to opening government. Again, the top half on a 2-1 split, chair in the minority. I will walk through the debate and go through where the core clashes and contentions were. Before that, I think just 2 general pieces of feedback. I think there was very little in particular from back half teams in what was a debate with not much breadth of argumentation, although some depth to argumentation. There wasn't too much in actual delineation between yourselves and your top half teams. That meant that we had to do a little bit of that, or some of that became clearer through engagement. I do think other panels would have called this debate fairly differently as a result of that. And I do think it's something that all teams just want to be aware of in these kinds of motions where you might not think that there is as much scope for you to move laterally and that you're going to have to vertically extend off of teams. The second thing, just on this debate, and particularly for prop, there was a lot of focus around Google Flights as like the core example that people wanted to use. And I do to an extent understand why. I think that particularly on prop, this is a very odd example because there's not much benefit to competition. Like, and everybody is aware of who the other competitors are anyway. Like everyone's aware of Skyscanner, Expedia, Trivago. Like I think this is probably just like more whenever you try and buy like knickknacks off of Amazon, like you need some extension cables or you need some batteries. Like it's also that sort of stuff where you do just get loads of genuinely crap products that are pushed as alternatives. And I do think there's quite a bit of scope to just think about what is the most useful piece of framing for yourselves within this round. So I would just give really encourage teams to think about what the useful example is for your side. In terms of the top half, so the top half is well, the debate as a whole was very close. The top half in particular was incredibly close, and I think there are several reasons for this. So in opening government, we get the push, which is we will get more companies and we will have more competition as a result of that. Competition means that you get better products for the consumers, you get better flight aggregators as a result of having this. I think there are some extensions that we get, particularly through the DPM, as to how it is that these platforms will often use the main mechanism for how you get that better competition and better products is that when people are more easily able to switch between different platforms, the data that is gathered about how people are moving between them and about the preferences that they're able to have enables you to then make those better products. Opening opposition's push is Google Flights is really, really good because Google has lots of data, can tailor it to you in whatever way it likes. That's point one. Point two, if they didn't do this, they would do other worse things. They would basically de-platform people to a large extent because they still want to maintain some sort of market monopoly. They still want to be able to ensure that then, particularly when we're talking about relatively nascent things like Google Flights has been, they want to give it some level of protection and ensure that it can compete moving forward into the future. I think this is all perfectly fine and very, very reasonable. I do think, but for both top half teams, there is a distinct lack of actual weighing off what of these things is the most important within the round, and I do think that's part of what makes this fairly close. So I think firstly, dealing with the contention around data. So the opening opposition push being Google uses all this data, therefore is better. And in ensuring that it is better and it has all of this, we give you a better product. Opening government only care about competition insofar as it gives you a better product. Therefore, if Google is better, then they win. Opening government's claim is the data is only useful insofar as you can have and account for some of that switching, and that's what makes it better. I think that intuitively, the opening government, and this is why part of where the split comes down, I do think that opening government claims wins on the data point because I think the way it's proven, particularly through the DPM, is why this is the most important driver within improving the quality of data that then improves the quality of the product. Given both sides agree that data is what is improving the quality of the product, having access to data that contains more information about your preferences is only able to be done when you have a less monopolized and more competitive market because you can understand switching preferences. I don't think that gets a significant enough response or really any response coming out of opening opposition. Where I think the top half becomes particularly unclear or particularly challenging is when we discuss what the alternatives or alternative approaches that Google and others can take are. So the opening opposition claim is they will still want to retain a lot of this power, therefore they will just not give platforms to Expedia et al. And other groups. I think this is all a fairly useful comparative for opening opposition to set up, and there is a question for the panel that we came to divergent views on as to whether or not that we believe that this is the alternative. If we believe that this is the alternative, that they would be deplatformed, then opening government cannot get the switching preferences stuff, right? And that is the main way in which they're accessing their benefits. Ergo, if they don't get it, then the better product being produced by Google as a result of them having access to all of your data is still quite useful for opening opposition and would necessarily win on the top half. The view of the panelists was that this wasn't pushed back on particularly strongly. I do think there are some responses coming from opening government around specifically around why it is that given that Google requires all of this data, it is unlikely to sort of massively deplatform people. I think there are also acceptances across the top half that this would lead to a level of sort of scrutiny and pushback by regulators. And I do think those responses come from opening government. I do think, as a fair criticism of opening government, it is unclear that that is sufficient for them to not do this. And I do think it would be useful in future, even if you think there are implicit responses in your cases, to flag explicitly why they are sufficient to beat that. But the majority view of the panel was that this probably would happen to some extent, and that the extent that this would happen to is significant enough for you to then not be able to get your benefits, which unfortunately would mean that you end up losing on the top half to opening opposition. Bringing in closing government, because I think closing government then very neatly are able to beat the top half of this debate, which is that closing government, I think, whilst there are allusions to this within the opening government case, I do think is much clearer coming from closing government as to why it is that you are unable as Google to respond in this way, and therefore the deplatforming comparative just completely falls. And in doing so, I think they necessarily beat the comparative harms of opening opposition because they remove that comparative. But secondly, they're able to provide exactly the things that opening government need in order to very clearly beat that. The main way in which they go about doing this is yes, a little bit of not repetition. I do think there is genuinely a bit of extension as to why it is useful for them to help avoid regulators, etc., or avoid regulatory scrutiny, or like avoid is maybe a strong word. But I think the predominant way in which closing government go about doing this is explaining why it is that Google needs all of these, more structurally, why it is that Google needs all of these bodies on its platform in the App Store in order for it to be able to make money in the first place. And the profit model of a Google or of an Amazon is therefore based on this platforming, and it cannot function reasonably without platforming these other platforms to a large enough extent. I think in providing that, I think you remove much more clearly in closing government than in opening government that alternative model as set out by the opening opposition team. I think that there are then three things that closing government attempt to do in terms of delineating from that opening government. And I do think net you do some of these things. I do also think that these holes that you claim are in opening government are perhaps not as wholly as you might think. So I think that you explain quite well why it is that consumers can meaningfully access some of the alternatives, and explain a little bit, which is the first of the three prerequisites that you want to explain. The second two are that you're still going to allow competitors to operate, as sort of flagged. I think some of the stuff that you're talking about is new. A lot of the stuff that you talk about is extensionable material off of opening government. And then thirdly, that you actually have these companies able to act as competitors. You flag that they need a meaningful amount of companies, particularly if you're talking about nascent industries. Then lots of companies are going to move into it, and if you know you're going to be outcompeted, it's then very hard to get a level of investment. All of these things I think are very true. All of the things I think are very useful. I don't think that in either speech any of these things are actually weighed as to. Like I think at the start of Aidan's speech, you sort of get here are some holes in opening government. I'm not actually sure how important these holes are. I think you sort of say, and if you believe any of them, we have to beat them. But you don't actually explain why that's true. I don't think that's done across either of the prop closing prop speeches, which would have been useful if we were in a world where we were trying to understand the extent to which the extensions you are making actually outweigh the opening government case. But insofar as you've sort of filled in probably the main hole and filled in the main tension within the top half, necessarily you're able to take it over that. Just think for rounds moving forward, it'd be useful to flag the extent to which you are actually adding material to your opening government and why that is particularly important. Bringing in closing opposition and again explaining closing opposition versus in particular the top half. So I think the thing that closing opposition do very smartly is drop the comparative around deplatforming and instead flag why it is that you're not just going to get people like completely ripped off of the App Store as because closing government have already shown why that won't happen, why that can't happen. But instead, what you're going to have, particularly when you're looking at like searches or when you're looking on Amazon, you're going to have more scammy products and that very naive customers are going to pick up on that. I think a few things on this. Firstly, I think that you do a very good job in what is just like a take a step back from the debate and call bullshit on quite a lot of it. Like there are so many people that use it. So many people are going to act in very, very different ways. Let's chunk up people into some different, slightly nuanced groups rather than people who just can't scroll to the second thing or people that don't have that ability. And I think that was very useful in highlighting that there are a group of people who are probably a quite large in number group of people who are quite naive. And it's useful to have less scammy things on there. I do think there is a question in my mind as to why it is that these scammier products would necessarily move up the order versus a Skyscanner versus a Trivago, or if your claim is that these other companies would become scammier in what they're doing. I think there's a little bit that would be quite useful to just make it a little clearer as to what the actual how that harm materializes. But I don't think that it actually gets very much pushback on either bench. I think the one response that we get is sort of, but why is there an incentive if people are quite naive to sort of improve Google flights or whatever anyway? And I do think that your characterization of this helps deal with that, which is, well, there's a different group who do look at things, so there's an incentive to monetize that. But I don't think that many people, that there's really a strong response as to why it is that you're not going to have a level of scamming off of the back of this. I then think the last thing that is, I think, done really quite well in the extension and dropped a bit in WIP is analyzing again the profit structure of Google, Amazon, etc., and flagging how the profits made off of these enable them to do lots of good things and provide lots of free products, whether that's Google Drive, whether that is like being able to provide their services to poorer countries or countries with slightly weaker infrastructure, and being able to then deliver the things that they have off the back of that. My view is that this is intuitively the most impactful thing in a fairly low impact debate that everybody has conceded is pretty low impact and hasn't been weighed as particularly impactful. And I think that that is quite useful. Independent of that, I do think that in closing opposition, you set up a very clear sort of delineation of here are the sort of scammy things that can be provided. And this is very, very harmful for a large group of people. I do think some elucidation of what that harm actually looks like would have been helpful. And again, on the back half, there's a bit of a discussion that as a panel, we obviously came to a non-agreed call on. But I think the view of the majority is largely that it's quite unclear the extent to which this is actually meaningfully harmful, particularly given the sort of responses that I flagged earlier coming back from closing government, and not necessarily everybody buying some of the framing and setting up and setup that has been done in the closing opposition case. I think there are some responses that we do get from the government whip that help explain why a lot of the old models of Zoom and Facebook, which presumably cross-apply to Amazon and Google, or I'm assuming from is implicit within their case, mean that you can't just tamper with various parts of the algorithm, whether it's because it's operating on outdated code, whether it's because there are huge incumbent biases already for them. Do you help them to an extent ameliorate or mitigate against some of your harms? Personally, not convinced that they do it to the fullest extent, but I do think that there is a general view on the panel that there is enough within the responsive work that mitigates what is an unclear harm, given closing governments then focus on explaining why this necessarily leads to better products and better competition at the top end for admittedly a different group of people than the group of naive people that you're talking about. And then I think that then just in terms of things that you can do in closing opposition to make it clearer to a panel that you have won the debate is just explaining if you're going to provide nuanced groups and different buckets of nuanced groups. I don't think there's actually much weighing as to, other than just saying there are some naive people, why that group of people is a more important actor within the round than the group of people that might scroll through and look at lots of different things. As a result of that, I think it is reasonable for the panel to come to the call that was came to, whereby I think they view the other group as more important. But yeah, feel free to discuss with them. That is everything I wanted to rattle through. Hope that was useful. Feel free to drop us a line if you want more feedback. And also, please do feel free to speak to my other panelists, because obviously there are a range of views on what was a very close and very tight debate. Thanks.